Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to raw pack meat. I got a couple of good deals at the grocery store. This is beef tri-tip, and I got $4.99 a pound on that deal. They only had one, or I would have bought more. And then they also had already chunked pork for $1.99 a pound, which is pretty darn good. So I got all that they had left of that, and I have about 2 pounds of pork and about 3 pounds of beef. So that is going to make about 5 pints of canned meat. So that'll be great. Canned meat is very, very useful to have in your pantry. The best thing about it is when you can it, it tenderizes the meat. It's much better than even if you slow cook it all day. And it also makes its own gravy. As far as pork is concerned, I like to can it because I know it's thoroughly cooked, and you need to really thoroughly cook pork before you eat it without fail, because pork has been known to carry parasites. When you can your own meat, it makes a really nice gravy that you can just thicken up and use. You can use canned meat for soups, stews, pot pies, casseroles, chili. You can make pork and beans, barbecued pork, barbecued beef, chop suey, chow mein. You can even spice pork when you put it into the jars to make carnitas. That's really my favorite way to prepare it. You can use the shredded meat for fried rice. You can just mix up the meat with gravy and serve it over noodles or serve it over mashed potatoes, whatever you'd like to do. And the good thing about it too, another good thing, there's so many good points to canning, and I'm just learning about canning since I've retired, and it's so useful. But another, if you're working still and you have canned food on the shelf, say you come home from work, you didn't plan ahead, you don't have something in the slow cooker that's been cooking all day. Even the Instant Pot, if you're going to cook something in the Instant Pot, even that takes an hour or maybe almost 2 hours to have something ready to go for dinner. Whereas if you have some canned meat on the shelf, all you have to do is pop open the can, add a few extra ingredients and a few sides, and dinner's ready. So let me see what else I can tell you about canned meat. As far as canned pork, if you make spiced pork, you can make goodies like carnitas, you can make tacos, you can make enchiladas, chili verde, and I believe you could do the same with beef too. I have never made Mexican style spiced beef, but you could do that. And the reason why I like to spice the pork before I can it, or as I'm canning it, is the flavors really meld into the meat. And I use that spiced pork a lot. It's called carnitas, and I use it in a lot of dishes. It tastes good for chili too, as well as for chili verde and regular chili. So as far as canning meat, it's something that's very easy to do. Basically, you just chunk up your meat, put it in the jars. About a pound of meat will fill a pint jar. You don't even have to add any broth because the meat makes its own juice. I do tend to add a little bit of broth because I don't like to end up with a can at the end of the processing time that's got a liquid level that's very low. I don't like that. It doesn't feel safe to me, especially when it's extremely low, and I just like to have a little extra juice in there. I don't like to have the meat discolored at the end. So that's why I do that. But you don't have to add extra juice because the meat has its own juices and it'll make its own gravy. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so I've got my pint jars handy here. I find a pint is a useful size. I just have an empty nester home here. There's just 2 of us. So this is a good amount to make a portion for 1, or for 2 if you're going to add the meat to something else. And I've got my 5 pints here. It's important to plan ahead. So if you know that 1 pound of meat is going to fill a pint jar, then I know I have approximately 5 pounds of meat here in total. So it should hopefully fill these 5 jars. And when canning, it's always recommended that you at least use a canner load with a minimum amount of 2 quarts or 4 pints. That is the minimum you should do with a load. And the reason for that is because the cool down time after the canning timing is finished, there's a certain period where it stays very hot, and that cool down period is included in the processing time, and it's necessary. And you've got to have a certain amount of bulk or a certain amount of solid material in your canner to get that cool down. That's a slow cool down. If you had just one jar, nothing around it, it would cool down pretty quickly, and it might not process for the proper amount of time to kill the spores that can cause botulism. So we want to do everything safely. So I'm going to do at least 4 pints, and hopefully I'll even have 5. And I'll be canning these in my small Presto stovetop canner. Okay, so we're going to get the beef cut. Since the pork was already cut for me at the grocery store by the butcher, I didn't have to do that, but I'm going to chunk up the roast beef here into about 1-inch chunks. And we are going to be pressure canning this meat. You have to pressure can low acid foods, so anything that's not tomato, pickled, jams and jellies that are not pickled but they're high in sugar. Sugary foods and low acid foods are fine to water bath can, but everything else is going to need to be pressure canned. So we'll come back when we've got all this meat cubed. Okay, so I've separated off most of the fat. It's well marbled meat, so it has a lot of fat naturally marbled into the meat. And I don't want to have too much fat, because too much fat will rise to the top of the jar and it might cause us to lose our seal. But here we've lost very little actually. Very little of this has been cut away. So we've got a good amount here. This is a beef tri-tip, and it's if you cook it nicely, it's very tender, and it's going to be really great in jars. Okay, so we've got all our supplies lined up here. I've got my Presto 16-quart stovetop canner, and I've put 3 quarts of water in there. We are loading room temperature or cold product into room temperature jars, and we're going to put them into room temperature canner and bring it all up to a boil at the same time. So you don't have to bring your water to a boil before you can this, because it's starting off as a product that's not hot. Hot pack is different from cold pack. So here is the pork. We're going to just load up a couple of jars of pork. You could use your hands if you want to. I wash my hands frequently in the kitchen, but I just prefer not to handle things if I can help it. You don't want to be handling food more than you have to. Okay, so we've got 1 jar, pretty much maybe over full. I don't know. Let's see if the rest of this, it's about 2 pounds, so I'm figuring it was 2 jars worth of pork. So let's see how it's going to work out. Gosh, I may have another, a little bit more. No, I think I actually have enough to make a 3rd jar of pork. So good, I'm going to have more jars than I anticipated. Awesome. I think this will probably just about do another full jar. Okay, so my 2 pounds of pork actually filled 3 pint jars. I want to leave a little bit over 1 inch headspace in these jars, and so this is about right. So here we've got our 3 jars. 3 jars of pork. I may press this one down a little bit more. I'm going to get my chopsticks here to help compress this down a little better. You don't have to pack it in there really tight, just sort of loosely. It's going to shrink down as it cooks, so I like to get enough in there that it's not going to shrink down to nothing. You have a big, I think that one's got a little bit too much, so I'm going to redistribute this. Maybe to this jar in the back, There, I think that's a little better. Okay, now let's do the beef. And I'm gonna run to the storage area and get 2 more jars for my beef, at least, maybe 3. I forgot to mention, so let's just back up. The equipment I'm going to need, of course, my jars, which have been they've been used in the past, so I checked the rims to make sure there's no chips or cracks. I washed these with soap and warm water and rinsed them really well. I took the lids, and I like to put them in warm water just so the sealing compound can soften up a little bit. You do not have to do anything with the lids other than just rinse them off. USDA no longer requires us to pre-sterilize jars and lids for anything. And I just went to the garage and got a couple more jars. Unfortunately for meat, I really like to use the wide mouth jars because it's much easier to get the product out when you're finished. All you have to do is use a little spoon or something and it'll come right out. Whereas if you have a regular mouth jar and you have to try to clean it or get your hand in there or get the meat out, it might be a little more difficult because the mouth is narrower. So it's just personal preference. I'm really liking the wide mouth jars, and I need to stock up with another few cases if I can find them in the stores. Here's another pint, kind of a decorative pint that I got about a year or so ago from Ball. And I'm not going to use my homemade broth. I'm going to use up my Better Than bouillon. So I have just a little bit left of this, and then I won't be repurchasing simply because I'm going to be using my own beef broth in dishes from now on. This is just way too salty for me. So I have a little bit here, and it's fairly dilute, so I'm going to use that to top off these jars when they're ready for processing. And I'm using tongs, as you saw earlier. Tongs to load the jars. I've got a funnel. Now, if you don't have tongs and funnels, you can just wash your hands and, pack the food in the jars with your hands. It's just personal preference. Okay, so let's get the beef into the jars. So first I'm going to fill my 3 wide mouth jars, and then if I have additional beef left over, which I think I will, I'll use the narrow mouth jars. And like I said, I'm not going to add any seasoning or anything to these jars. I am going to add a little bit of broth because I don't like my jars to be kind of a third empty, which is what will happen if you loosely pack this. It'll shrink down when you cook it, and there'll be a lot of headspace at the top. Okay, so let me get these packed, and we'll be back in a minute. Okay, so we actually got 3 and 3. 3 jars of beef, and the amount of beef that I bought at the store was 2.88 pounds. And we've got 3 pints of pork, and I guess the pork it's about 2 1/3 pounds of pork, and it's more loosely packed than the beef. Okay, so what we're going to do next, and this is totally optional, I'm going to put my other decorative pints aside. You can put the lids on and can them just like this, but what I like to do is add just a little bit of broth to each jar. So I'm going to do that next. And I'm going to just show you one jar. It's hard for me to do this. Okay. Okay, so I've got my trusty chopsticks here. I like to use these for letting the liquid go down into the jars. Sort of like debubbling. Similar process. Like I said, it's totally optional. You don't need to do it, but I like to do it. Okay, so there's a little bit of broth in there, and I have left my 1-inch headspace. So you want to make sure you've got at least 1-inch headspace in each jar. Okay, let me do the rest, and we'll come back after we're finished. Next, we're going to wipe the rims of each jar with a little bit of vinegar on our cloth. That helps to cut any fat that might be on the rim of the jar. You also want to clean around the threads so that your ring does not stick when you try to open it. So we're going to go do that to each jar. Okay, so we've wiped all the edges of the jars. Next, we're going to grab our lids and rings. Just try to center the lid on there as best you can. The ring finger tight, which means just that. What I'm going to do, these 3 jars are pork and these other 3 jars are beef. So since they're going into the same canner, I probably won't be able to tell them apart later on reliably. I mean, I'm sure they'll look a little different. The pork looks a little different in texture and color from the beef, but I'm going to mark the lids of the pork with just a little dot so that I'll know what's what when I go to pull these out of the canner. Switch hands here because I'm right-handed, finger tight. Okay, and here's our last jar. Okay, let's get these puppies let's get these jars into our canner. Oops, I almost forgot to mark the jars so I'll know which is pork and which is beef. So my pork is going to have a little dot on the lid. And the beef is going to not have a little dot on the lid. Into the canner they go. Nothing's hot, so I don't need to use my jar lifter. I'll need that when they come out. So we have 6 pints of meat. It's going to make 6 meals of delicious whatever we choose to make. Okay. You're going to line up. There's a V here. You're going to line that up with the V on your lid. When you do that, it should pretty much fall down into place. There we go. And then you're just going to slide this over. I don't know if you could see me doing that, but you slide that into place. It was here. You slide it over until it stops. We have already checked to make sure that this steam vent is clear. This is the overpressure plug. It's in place. I've checked the gasket inside and it's sealing nicely. This is going to pop up to seal the canner when the pressure is attained inside. So what we're going to do next is turn on the heat. Kind of medium-high. We're going to let this heat up until we see a steady stream of steam coming through this vent. Then after that, we let the canner vent for 10 full minutes. After that, we'll put our weight on. For my elevation, I use a 10-pound weight. Once the weight begins to rock, then we'll start the timing of our meat for 75 minutes because these are pints. If it was quarts, we would time them for 90 minutes. Okay, we've pretty much got a steady stream of steam coming out of our vent. So I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. And after this has steamed and vented for 10 minutes, we're going to put the weight on. Our 10 minutes is up. Coincidentally, this little lock button just now popped up. So I'm going to put the weight on. For my elevation, which is less than 1,000 feet, I only need a 10-pound weight. If you lived at a higher elevation, you put another one of these 5-pound thingies on this weight here. So we're going to wait now. I'm going to leave my heat in kind of a medium high, and as soon as this starts to jiggle and dance, we're going to start timing our product inside for 75 minutes because it's pints. If it was quarts, we'd time it for 90 minutes. Okay. Our jiggler is beginning to do a hula dance, so I'm going to turn down my heat just a little bit and start my timer for 75 minutes. I turned my heat down to medium. I don't want this to completely stop rocking. If it stops rocking, you've turned your heat down too low. So we'll keep an eye on this for the whole 75 minutes to make sure the heat is just right. This has been steadily jiggling like this for an hour. We've got another 15 minutes to go. And this is about what it should look like through the whole processing time. We've been rocking like this for 90 minutes. I'm going to turn my heat off. That's all I do at this point. We are just going to let this canner naturally depressurize. So first thing, this rocker is going to stop rocking. You don't want to remove that. You want to leave that on there. You're going to wait till the pin drops. It's going to probably take 45 minutes to an hour for this canner to depressurize. So we'll come back after that's done. Okay, it's been about 45 minutes. The locking pin has dropped, indicating there's no pressure. We're going to take off the weight. No steam coming out. We'll undo the lid here. Okay. Kind of open it away from you because there will be steam in there. There goes a little bit of steam. And let's get these jars out of the canner. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes. I've removed the lid. Let's see what we've got here. Looks pretty good. Not much siphoning. I can see a little bit of fatty stuff in the canner there, so there was a minimal amount of siphonage. There are the 3 pork. They've got the little dots on the jar. And the other 3 are beef. Everything looks good. Still bubbling in the jars. So we'll let these just cool down and take their own time on their own schedule. Okay, the jars are cool. It's been about 12 hours. I did not have a lot of siphonage. There was some. I could see the grease around the rim of the jar here, but all of them have sealed. I can lift them by the lid. So I'm going to have some good meat on my shelves. I'm going to get these jars washed off. Take care, and we'll see you all again next time.